April 30th, 1945. Berlin was burning. The Red Army had surrounded the city. Every street had become a battlefield, every intersection a grave. But near the shattered heart of the Reichstag, one last Tiger tank still moved. Its armor was scarred, its paint blistered, its crew down to their final shells. They knew they couldn't win. But they weren't fighting for victory anymore, only for time, and for the pride of a nation that no longer existed. This is the story of the last Tiger tank that fought beneath the Reichstag. Before we dive into one of the final battles ever fought in Berlin, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy the stories I tell here. And let me know in the comments where you are watching from and what time it is for you right now. It's always fascinating to see how far these stories travel and who is joining us from across the world. Now let us begin. Chapter 1. The Steel Beast in the Ruins. April 29th, 1945. Berlin was no longer a city, it was a wound that refused to close. The once proud boulevards were now rivers of rubble. The air smelled of ash, oil, and despair. In the west, the Tiergarten burned like a forest of ghosts. Every street echoed with the rattle of machine guns and the thunder of Soviet artillery. Civilians crawled through basements, dragging suitcases filled with nothing worth saving. Above them, black smoke twisted into the gray April sky, the funeral veil of a dying empire. And yet, amid that inferno, something still moved. In a shattered courtyard near the Moltke Bridge, a single Tiger I tank rumbled awake. Its massive Maybach engine coughed, then growled, sending vibrations through the broken ground. The Beast S armor, once polished, now charred and dented, still bore the faded insignia of the 503rd Heavy Panzer Battalion. On its side, in chalk and soot, someone had scrawled 2 words, bis zum Ende, until the end. Inside, 3 men remained. SS Hauptscharführer Wilhelm Behrens, the commander, was 32, a veteran of Kursk, Narva, and Normandy. His eyes were pale and cold, trained by 5 years of killing to see without feeling. Beside him sat Otto Weber, the gunner, a former mechanic from Hamburg, who could hit a tank at 1,000 meters without thinking. And crouched behind the ammunition racks was Kurt Jaeger, just 19. The loader his first battle was also his last. Their Tiger was dying. One track was damaged, the radio had gone silent, and the smell of fuel leaks mixed with the metallic tang of blood. They had 5 armor-piercing shells, left 5 chances to make a difference, or to die trying. Through the cracked periscope, Behrens could see the Reichstag, its black dome fractured, columns shredded by shells. Around it, Soviet tanks were massing for the final assault. The red tide was closing in. He knew what it meant. Once the Reichstag fell, the war was over. But for Behrens, surrender was unthinkable. He had buried too many friends to die in silence. He glanced at the photograph taped to the turret wall, a woman and a little boy smiling beside a lake. His family, far away in the north, perhaps already gone. The Reich no longer meant anything to him, but those faces still did. He couldn't explain why, but staying inside that tank, fighting on, felt like the only way to keep them alive, if only in his mind. Outside, the Soviets' artillery fire crept closer. The ground shook with each impact. Dust rained from the ceiling of a nearby building. The Tiger shuddered, its engine coughing smoke like an old animal in pain. "Otto," Behrens said quietly, "check the gun." Weber nodded, his hands steady despite the chaos. Loaded and ready. "Kurt," Behrens added, "keep your head down. We fight, then we move." The boy just nodded, lips trembling, clutching the last shell like it was holy. A Soviet shell slammed into the street, sending a rain of bricks across the Tiger S hull. The sound was deafening. For a moment, everything went silent except the ringing in their ears. Then Behrens spoke, almost to himself. "This is where we hold." He pulled down the hatch and signaled Otto to start the engine. The Tiger-S gears screamed as it rolled forward through the debris, its tracks grinding over the bones of the city. A shadow of steel moving through the graveyard of the Reich. As it turned toward the Reichstag, the morning sun broke through the smoke, a pale, colorless light falling across its scorched armor. From a distance, it must have looked impossible. A single Tiger tank, still advancing, still alive, in a city that had already died. For a fleeting moment, the great machine became more than metal and men. It was the last heartbeat of a collapsing empire. And though Behrens knew they would never leave Berlin, he pushed forward anyway. The Tiger roared again, its engine echoing down the empty streets. The final hunt had begun. Chapter 2. Into the fire. Dawn crept over Berlin like a reluctant witness. The first gray light of morning revealed a landscape that no longer belonged to the living. The streets around the Moltke Bridge were nothing but twisted steel and shattered facades. Fires smoldered in the ruins, their smoke curling upward like the last prayers of the city. From his seat in the Tiger, Wilhelm Behrens could feel the vibrations before he heard them, the deep, rolling thunder of Soviet artillery drawing nearer. The Red Army was advancing from the east, sweeping street by street toward the Reichstag. The Germans had nothing left but scattered pockets of resistance. Boys with Panzerfausts, old men clutching rifles from another war, and a handful of tanks that refused to die. His was one of them. Behrens lifted his periscope. Through the haze, he could make out the dark silhouettes of T-34s moving between the ruins. They were cautious, methodical, their turrets scanning every alley. Behind them marched columns of infantry, red stars gleaming faintly on their helmets. The enemy had come to finish the war. "Otto," Behrens said, voice calm but tight, "range the lead tank 200 meters. Otto's hands moved automatically, adjusting the elevation. "Ready. Kurt, load armor piercing." The boy's fingers fumbled for a shell, the brass casing slick with sweat. He slammed it into the breech with a metallic click. For a heartbeat, everything was still, just the low hum of the engine and the muffled rumble of battle in the distance. Then Behrens gave the order. "Fire!" The Tiger-S 88mm cannon roared. The recoil slammed through the hull. Outside, the shell tore through the morning air, struck the T-34S turret, and detonated in a blinding flash. The Soviet tank vanished in flame. "Hit," Otto muttered, almost in disbelief. Behrens didn't answer. He was already tracking the next one. Another round, another explosion. The smell of burning fuel and cordite filled the cabin. Each shot shook the world around them, but for every T-34 that fell, 2 more appeared through the smoke. The Soviets advanced like a tide that couldn't be stopped. The Tiger backed into position between 2 wrecked trams, using them as cover. Shells slammed into the buildings nearby, sending clouds of dust across the narrow street. A wall collapsed just meters away, showering the tank in bricks and fire. Inside, the men coughed violently, lungs filling with smoke. "Reload," Behrens barked. Kurt obeyed without hesitation, though his hands trembled. The heat inside the turret was unbearable, the smell of oil, sweat, and iron, thick enough to taste. Each reload felt slower than the last, every second stretching into eternity. A shell struck the Tiger-S side armor. The tank rocked violently but held. Behrens exhaled slowly. They were lucky. One more hit like that, and it would be over. He could hear Otto cursing under his breath, sighting through the cracked optics. Too many of them, he said. I know, Barons replied. We hold until they can tee. For hours they traded fire. The Tiger S gun barked again and again, spitting defiance into the inferno. Soviet shells exploded around them, collapsing entire buildings, filling the air with dust so thick it turned day into dusk. Each explosion felt closer, louder, hungrier. By noon, they were down to 2 rounds. Outside, the bodies of fallen soldiers littered the streets, Soviet and German alike. Smoke drifted low, curling around the Tiger S tracks. The city sounded like it was tearing itself apart. Tank engines, machine gun bursts, and the deep, endless rhythm of artillery. Somewhere behind them, church bells rang once, then fell silent. Barons sat back for a moment, hands on the controls, eyes fixed on the shattered skyline. The Reichstag was still there, a blackened shadow on the horizon. Still standing, he murmured. So are we. He didn't say it out of pride. He said it because it was the only truth left. The Tiger growled as he pushed the throttle, crawling forward again through the wreckage. Flames reflected in its armor like the glow of a dying sun. They had become part of the city's heartbeat, 3 men inside a burning machine, refusing to yield. Each meter forward was a victory, each breath a borrowed miracle. And as the Red Army closed in, Barons realized something. The Tiger was no longer a weapon. It was a coffin that moved. Chapter 3. The Last Shell. By evening, the light over Berlin had turned the color of rust. The air was thick with soot, smoke, and the faint metallic taste of blood. All around the Tiger, the world was collapsing, streets buckling under bombardment, buildings folding into themselves like dying giants. Inside the tank, the crew was running on instinct and fumes. The gauges were failing, the radio was dead, and the ammunition racks were almost empty. They had been fighting for nearly 10 hours, and the once mighty Tiger now felt like a tomb that breathed. Wilhelm Behrens sat half-slumped in his seat, one hand gripping the control lever, the other pressed to a bleeding gash on his forehead. Every muscle in his body ached. His eyes stung from the acrid smoke that poured through the ventilation slits. Kurt, the loader, coughed uncontrollably, black grime caking his face. Otto, ever silent, kept one eye on the cracked gun sight, whispering range estimates to himself like a prayer. Fuel S almost gone, Otto muttered. Barons gave a dry laugh. Then we were right on schedule. He looked around the turret, the walls scorched, the floor littered with empty shell casings, the smell of sweat and oil thick enough to choke on. They had fired every round they had left, everyone but one. One last shell. Held it in his lap, stroking the brass casing with trembling hands, as if afraid it might vanish. Barons met his eyes. That is our last word to history, he said quietly. Kurt nodded, his jaw tight. Then let S make them hear it. Through the narrow slit of the periscope, the world beyond looked like the inside of a furnace. Soviet tanks moved in the distance shadows through the fire, closer now. One of them was enormous, its turret squared and brutal. The markings were unmistakable. IS-2, Stalin S monster. The Soviet heavy tank was hunting them. Barons felt his heartbeat slow. He had seen these beasts before, their armor, thick enough to shrug off anything but a perfect shot. He looked at Otto. We aim for the turret ring. That is the only way. Otto adjusted the elevation, hands slick with sweat. Range? 200 meters. Close enough to shake hands, Otto muttered. Barons leaned toward Kurt. Load it. Kurt slid the final 88mm shell into the breech. The heavy click echoed like a verdict. The tank fell silent. Even the chaos outside seemed to hold its breath. Then the IS-2 fired first. The ground erupted. A shell exploded against a nearby building, showering the tiger with debris. Chunks of concrete slammed against the armor like hail. Behrens didn't flinch. He waited, watched. The Soviet gun turned again, lining up for the kill. "Now," he whispered. Otto pulled the trigger. The 88 roared a single thunderous note that cut through the inferno. The recoil slammed through the Tiger-S hull. Outside, the Soviet tank shuddered. A flash white, then orange, burst from its turret ring. The IS-2 lurched, belched smoke, then exploded in a violent fireball. The force of it rocked the Tiger backward, rattling its bolts and joints. For one fleeting second, they had done it. They had killed the beast. Kurt shouted, half laughing, half crying. Otto slammed a fist against the armor in disbelief. But the celebration lasted only a breath. The IS-2's final shot had already left its barrel. It struck the Tiger-S front plate dead on. The impact was a hammer blow. The armor held barely, but the shock wave shattered the optics, blew open panels, and ignited the engine compartment. Flames burst through the vents. The temperature inside the tank spiked instantly. Behrens yelled for the crew to bail out, his voice hoarse and raw. Otto was first, kicking open the hatch. Kurt followed, coughing, his sleeve on fire. Behrens climbed last, dragging his pistol belt behind him, the heat searing his boots. They tumbled out into the street, three figures rolling through dust and sparks. Behind them, the Tiger burned. The flames roared through the open hatches, devouring paint, steel, and memory. The 57-ton beast that had once terrified Europe now glowed like a dying sun. Behrens turned to watch it one last time. The turret sagged to the side, the barrel still pointing toward the Reichstag. He stood there, chest heaving, face streaked with soot. For a moment, he thought he heard the engine still running, the ghost of the machine refusing to die. Then it stopped. The silence was deafening. The last Tiger tank had fired its last shell. Chapter 4. The men who stayed. The fire behind them painted the night in orange and black. What had once been the most feared machine of war now burned like a funeral pyre in the middle of a dead street. The Tiger-S ammunition cooked off one shell at a time, dull, distant thumps echoing between the ruined buildings. Each explosion was a heartbeat fading away. Wilhelm Behrens stood in the flickering glow, chest heaving, his face streaked with soot and blood. The heat licked his back as he stared at the wreck. That tank had been his world, his armor, his pride, his grave in waiting. Now it was nothing but molten steel and memory. Behind him, Otto and Kurt stumbled into the shell of a tram station. The ground trembled with each artillery strike. Dust drifted from the ceiling like snow. They collapsed beside a broken bench, their breath ragged, ears still ringing from the blast. Kurt was shaking uncontrollably, his hands blistered, his hair singed. He was barely 19, and his eyes were already empty, the look of someone who had seen too much too soon. Otto pressed a hand to his shoulder. "You are alive," he said, but the words sounded strange, almost out of place in a city where nothing else lived. Outside, the war continued. The Soviets were pouring into the government quarter waves of infantry moving between the craters, shouting in Russian, rifles raised. Every few seconds, the heavy bark of a tank gun echoed from somewhere near the Reichstag. The great building itself loomed through the smoke, its dome cracked open, its flags gone. And yet, to Behrens, it still looked defiant, a black silhouette, refusing to kneel. He sank to the floor, back against the cold concrete. His gloves were burned through, his skin blistered where the flames had kissed it. He took a deep breath, and for the first time in days, realized there was no more fuel, no more orders, No more mission. The war, his war, was over. Otto broke the silence first. "We should move," he said. "They'll find us soon." Behrens didn't answer. He was staring at his hands, calloused, trembling, stained with oil and blood. He thought of the faces that had once filled his crew. Hans, the driver, killed 2 days ago when a shell pierced the engine deck. Dieter, the radio man, burned alive in the morning assault. Now only 3 remained, and even they were ghosts already. Kurt looked up suddenly. "Do you think they'll shoot us?" Otto sighed. "If we were lucky." Behrens said nothing. He reached into his tunic and pulled out a folded photograph his wife Anna, holding their son beside a small lake in Saxony. He stared at it for a long time, the firelight trembling across the paper. He could barely remember their voices anymore. He wondered if they survived the bombings, or if, like everything else, they had been swallowed by the fire. A distant explosion shook the ground. From the direction of the Reichstag came the sound of cheering, hundreds of voices rising through the smoke. Behrens looked toward the dome and saw it clearly now. A red flag fluttering in the firelight. Kurtz's voice cracked. "They've taken it." Behrens nodded slowly. "Yes, it's finished." He felt something loosen inside him, not despair, but exhaustion that went deeper than bone. The hatred, the loyalty, the slogans, all of it burned away, leaving nothing but the simple instinct to survive. When dawn broke, the 3 men stepped out of the station. The air was gray and still. Soviet tanks idled at the intersections, their crews scanning the ruins. Bodies lay scattered across the cobblestones, covered in dust. No one spoke. A patrol spotted them before they reached the next street. Behrens raised his hands. For a moment, the Russians hesitated. These 3 soot-blackened figures looked less like soldiers and more like survivors pulled from the underworld. A young Soviet lieutenant approached, rifle lowered. He stopped in front of Behrens, studying him in silence. Then he nodded toward the burning Tiger behind them. "You," he said in German, "you were the last one." Behrens met his gaze. His voice was hoarse but steady. "Someone had to be." The lieutenant didn't reply. He simply gestured for them to walk, and as the 3 Germans were led away through the rubble, the Tiger behind them finally collapsed inward, its frame groaning one last time before falling silent. For years afterward, Soviet soldiers who had fought in Berlin told stories of that tank, the one that refused to die, that fired until it burned, that stood alone in the ruins while the city fell. They called it Der letzte Tiger, the last tiger. Chapter 5. The Silent Machine. The war was over, at least, that's what the papers would say. But in the ruins of Berlin, nothing felt finished. Smoke still drifted through the skeletal remains of buildings. The air still smelled of cordite and ash, and the earth itself seemed to hum with leftover thunder. The Tiger lay where it had fallen, half buried in debris, its once glorious armor melted and torn open. Its turret was twisted at an awkward angle, its barrel still pointing toward the Reichstag, as if refusing to admit defeat, even in death. The great machine was silent now, its heart, the Maybach engine, cold, its steel bones already rusting under the spring rain. A few Soviet soldiers stood nearby, studying it. They spoke in low voices, taking photographs, marking coordinates. One of them reached up and tapped the barrel with the muzzle of his rifle. It gave a hollow, metallic echo, the last breath of a beast that had once terrified the world. Der letzte Tiger, one of them muttered. The name stuck. It was the only epitaph the tank would ever receive. Not far away, Wilhelm Behrens sat in a makeshift holding yard, one of hundreds of German prisoners gathered near the Tiergarten. He was filthy, bruised, unshaven. His uniform had been stripped of insignia, and the once crisp SS runes were nothing but soot marks on torn cloth. He didn't care. His eyes were fixed on the horizon, where a column of black smoke still rose from where the tiger had died. He could almost feel it through the ground, the same low vibration he'd lived with for years, the hum of gears, the heartbeat of steel. It was gone now, and with it, the last part of himself that had ever known purpose. Around him, the city groaned under the weight of silence. No sirens, no engines, no shouted orders, just the wind moving through the skeletons of buildings, whistling through shattered windows. Berlin had become a graveyard without crosses, a place where even echoes felt afraid to return. The Soviets processed prisoners with mechanical precision. Names, ranks, serial numbers typed, stamped, forgotten. Behrens gave his name without hesitation, though he doubted anyone would ever care enough to read it. When the guard asked his unit, he simply said, Tiger 231. It meant nothing to the man holding the clipboard, but to Behrens, it meant everything. That night, as the prisoners huddled beneath tarps and rain fell softly over the wreckage of the city, Behrens lay awake. He imagined the tiger still standing there, blackened, silent, watching over Berlin like a sentinel carved from smoke. He pictured Otto and Kurt sleeping nearby, and the ghosts of the men they'd lost sitting among them, hands folded, waiting for morning. He wondered if the world would ever understand what had happened here, how something so powerful, so fearsome, could end not with triumph, but with a quiet surrender. When dawn came, the rain had washed the soot into the gutters. The tiger was slick with water, its reflection shimmering in the puddles that filled the craters. Children would one day climb over that carcass, not knowing what it had meant. Scrap teams would come with torches and saws, cutting away the armor piece by piece until nothing was left. The metal would be melted down, reused, reshaped, maybe into farm tools, maybe into the frame of a train, maybe into the beams of a rebuilt city. The war's greatest monster would be reborn into peace without anyone realizing it. But for a while, before the scavengers came, the tiger remained a monument not of glory, but of futility. A symbol of men who fought long after the meaning of fighting had vanished. And when the last of the Soviet patrols left the area, the wind carried through the empty streets, brushing against the barrel and whispering through the jagged holes in the armor. It almost sounded like breathing. The city would rebuild. New generations would live above the ashes, unaware of the metal buried beneath their feet. But in the earth around the Reichstag, small fragments of that tiger would remain silent reminders of a day when Berlin itself seemed alive, roaring against the inevitable. The machine was gone. The men were gone. But the silence, the kind that follows after the last roar, that silence still belonged to them. Epilogue. The roar that echoed. Years later, long after the guns had fallen silent, Berlin was rebuilt, glass and steel rising where ashes once lay. Cars now hummed down the same streets where tanks had burned, and children played soccer in the open square beside the Reichstag. They laughed where others had died, and their voices echoed where once only the crack of rifles had been heard. Few who passed through that place ever thought about what lay beneath. But deep under the soil, mixed with bricks and bones and forgotten metals, rested fragments of a tiger tank, the last to fight, the last to fall. No one ever found the full wreck again. When Allied teams returned to Berlin in the 1950s, they discovered only scraps, a torn track link, part of a gun mantlet, and a single shell casing, stamped with the date April 1945. They cataloged them, labeled them, then moved on to the next ruin, another artifact from a war that seemed endless in memory. But to those who had been there, the tiger was not a relic, it was a legend. Among Soviet veterans, it was whispered about in mess halls and parades, the lone German tank that refused to retreat, the steel monster that kept firing while Berlin burned. No one knew the names of the men inside. They didn't need to. The story itself was enough. Wilhelm Behrens never told his. He spent years in captivity, then disappeared into the flood of displaced soldiers who returned to a country they no longer recognized. In the decades that followed, he worked quietly as a machinist in Hamburg, a man who could fix anything made of metal, but who never spoke of the one machine he had truly loved. When he died in 1972, his son found a small box among his belongings. Inside was a photograph, a wife and child, smiling by a lake, and a scrap of steel no larger than a coin. Carved into it, with a trembling hand, were two words, Bis zum Ende, until the end. In time, the world forgot. The ruins were cleared, the memories faded. The tiger became a footnote in history books, a line in a museum display, a black and white photograph that tourists glanced at before moving on. But for those who listen closely, the city still carries its echoes. On quiet nights, when the wind sweeps across the Tiergarten, you can almost hear it, the faint, ghostly rumble of treads over cobblestone, the deep growl of an engine fighting to stay alive, the defiant thunder of a cannon firing into the smoke. It isn't the sound of victory. It's something else, the echo of men who fought, not because they believed in the cause, but because they couldn't bear to stop fighting. The echo of loyalty twisted by time, of courage devoured by futility. It has the sound of the last roar of an empire collapsing under its own weight. History remembers who won the war, but the ruins remember who stood their ground when there is nothing left to stand for. And so the tiger remains not in steel, but in story. A whisper beneath the noise of modern Berlin, a reminder that even machines can carry the hearts of the men who built them, and that sometimes a single act of defiance can outlive the empire that demanded it. Stay healthy, subscribe if you enjoyed the video, and we'll see you in the next one. And if you have an idea for another untold story, share it in the comments. Your voice helps keep their memory alive.